right, Oleg, how are you?
I'm good, Jeff. How about you, sir?
I'm great, man. It's great to see you.
Yes.
It's been, I guess it's only been a few weeks or a few months, but great to see you. Hey, I'd love to, we keep it to 30 minutes, so I'd love to jump right in. Can you give folks a little bit of sense of your background and how you came to start People.ai?
Absolutely. Oleg Rogynskyy, CEO and founder of People.ai. Originally Ukrainian. I ended up having my first job as a BDR. I didn't know what it stands for back in the day, but after a few months of pounding the phones, I'll never forget a moment where our COO at the startup I was working at back in 2006 in Montreal grounded the whole team for about 2 weeks to go line by line through Salesforce and clean our data. And something felt really wrong about that at the time. Then 3-4 years later, I started my own company, and guess what I had to do? Same story.
Yeah, exactly.
Then 5 years later, I sold that company, joined another one, I had to do the same thing. So a decade into this problem persisting of sales leadership not having reliable, scalable, transparent, and data or telemetry on how their teams are performing and what makes the best people so good, I decided start the company to solve the problem. So think of it as Datadog for sales productivity.
I love it. I love it. And you went through YC. What was that like?
It was intense. I would highly recommend if it is an old format. I don't know what the format is today, but
What year was that?
2016. It was only about 100 companies in a batch.
Wow.
Which now I think is like what, 10,000.
Wow, that, you know what that means? You and I have known each other for a long time. You're making me feel old.
Well, and so from a perspective, it was really good because we actually had the personal touch. And Michael Seibel and Dalton Caldwell, who are still with YC, were my group partners, and they pushed us really, really hard. So
yeah,
our first product when we got into YC didn't work at all. So it was a pivot, one of those YC stories. And I'm glad they pushed us because YC, out of all things, it's not about investor introductions or whatnot. It is about people pressuring you to do the right thing.
Yeah, I love it. And so you come out of YC. And you ended up raising a Series A with Lightspeed with Knuckle. And that's right when I met you. In fact, I just was telling one of our LPs a story the other day because they said, well, at early stages, how do you make the decision? And I said, well, I'll tell you a story. I met Oleg, and within the first half hour, I told him I was in.
Yeah.
And they said, well, how do you make that decision? I said, it's based on, I really understood the problem he was trying to solve because I had run sales and marketing teams. And I could look across the table and realize that this guy was special. He had something very special in terms of a founder. And so I remember that first meeting fondly. So
I do remember too.
But I think, one of the things that I'd love to get into, and obviously for folks who don't know, People.ai now $1 billion plus company in terms of valuation. You guys do tens of millions in ARR and really kind of have become the leader in your category, which has been so fun to watch over the last 5 to 6 years. One thing I'd love to, there are a lot of things that people can say, oh, it's, up and to the right, it's all been easy. You and I were hanging out at my house this summer talking about this, and I think you made the comment, I've learned so much. I could build a company twice as large in half the time or something like that. So I'd love to just jump in, talk about some of the key lessons learned for you over the years, because I think that's, particularly for early stage founders, to hear from somebody like you who's you've raised multiple rounds of capital now from Lightspeed, Andreessen, Iconic, us. Let's just jump in. Couple lessons learned. What have you learned about, maybe start with team building and leadership? Because I know I've always been super impressed with the thoughtfulness that you put into the team building aspect of the way you built the company.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'm looking at my bookshelf. There's a book that changed everything. I don't have it in front of me right now, but there's a book called Who that I follow to the T. And it is actually, for anybody who is not an IC role, it is a fireable offense at People.ai not to follow the process in the book, which actually allows you to figure out how to efficiently and precisely hire the person whose job you have no idea how to do yourself. And turns out there's a framework. And so Jeff Stump and Andreessen is the one who sent me to that book, and we've been following it since. And that book is one of the reasons why we've been able to hire so well. And actually, if I were to to attribute kind of, if there was one thing I'm good at is hiring people who are doing something better than me, and everything else kind of falls in place afterwards. And so that's about building the early team. The other piece that is very hard to understand while you're in it, but then becomes an obvious thing once you look back, is on one hand, you want to hire as senior of people as you can get. On the other hand, too senior, non-stage appropriate is also a problem, because too senior people build for massive scale, which could be ahead of the economic or the product market fit position of your company.
Yep.
And so that means massive expense, that means more burn, and it means the chances of success. In some way, you'll have a much higher chance of hyperscale. In the other way, if you fail pretty hard.
And so how do you balance that? Because that is something that everybody wrestles with. Every CEO wrestles with. I want to go hire this really senior rock star type hire, but I also have to have a culture of scrappiness and hard work. And, you know, people famously sort of say, well, I don't hire people from Facebook or Google or Salesforce because they come in and don't work as hard as people who are in a startup environment. So how have you balanced that? Any advice you can share for folks who are trying to learn from what you've learned?
To be honest, I wish I had a good answer there.
There's no silver bullet, right?
Because you can hold off and keep the startup crew kind of for as long as possible, which rather quickly turns into a shit show, because you have a bunch of people who are very smart by having on the job, and everybody's figuring out on the fly, and you're probably repeating the mistakes that other people already made.
Yeah.
Or you can go very senior, and then you start building for massive scale, which you may or may not reach, and then it's a waste of resources. So it's a very delicate balancing act that I haven't seen many companies, like, people oscillate.
It's hard.
Nobody nails it right. So the main advice I can give there is the Frank Slootman's book, the piece about, the book is right here. I ramped it up.
Great book.
Yes, the piece there about finding and eliminating slack in the company is what I think is the recipe, where if you have a more junior team, they'll probably have tension in terms of stretching up, and you can help them through coaching. If you have a more senior team, you need to identify and find that slack and kind of push on it really hard until there is no more extra resources being wasted. And that's how Frank is doing it.
And a lot of folks have been going through that this year, pretty amazingly. I have several companies that have done riffs, and it's amazing. 90 days later, everybody says, gosh, we had a lot of slack. We had a lot of people that weren't as productive as I would have liked in 2021. And 2022 is sort of the reckoning where everybody is saying, gosh, even now you're seeing Facebook and Google and Microsoft even come out and say this. So it's an interesting moment in time.
Yeah. Well,
what about
allows you to throw money at the problem without thinking about it versus solving actual problem?
Yeah. What about, I know you've learned a ton about selling enterprise software to large customers, and you guys have a blue chip roster of customers. Any lessons you can share there about, you always have sort of the cold start problem where once you have a whole bunch of reference customers, then it's all about scaling the sales team. But in the early days, wind back the clock to the early days about People.ai. How did you go land your first few customers, and how did you scale that model, and how did you replicate it and grow it to where it is today?
So our first large customer was Palo Alto Networks, and we got lucky.
Good one to have.
didn't mind having them. It was a 3-year deal. It was a 6-figure right away, and it was quite something. And we were only 1 year old, so that definitely helped. But what worked for us then is to find an executive who had the same vision as us, and they were actually having a team of about 40 people internally trying to build their own in-house People.ai.
Oh, wow.
And so when we identified that, our pitch was not, hey, let me sell you something new. Our pitch was, let us be that team for you so you can spend your internal resources on something higher value add. Let us build this system that you want to have here, and sign them up as design partners. So I feel a lot of founders make a mistake of trying to sign up as design partners people who kind of interested in the topic, While in reality, you should spend more time and find people who are already investing their time, energy, and effort into making that vision a reality.
They're already committed. Yeah.
They're already committed.
Interesting.
That's when the design partnership will be the most fruitful.
So you're part of their plan versus selling them on this new concept. I love that.
On having a plan, yeah.
Yeah. And then it's sort of, and then the model for replicating that was teaching the team to go find more of those.
Yeah. In fact, turns out customers, especially in enterprise, visionaries hang out with visionaries. So the moment we crushed it with Palo Alto Networks, the next thing they did, the CMO of Palo Alto Networks, literally in front of me, introduced me to CMO of AppDynamics and CMO of Okta, saying, hey, we were just having drinks and talking about maybe someone one day can solve this problem.
Amazing.
Suddenly we got 2 more customers, then introduced us to MuleSoft, and it just kept on going. So those visionaries, it's the pre-cosm, Jeffrey Moore kind of crossing the cosm piece. The pre-cosm innovators, turns out, all know each other.
Yeah.
And you go really well with them, that's how you get them. The danger happens afterwards, where if you build the product to be fully focused on those innovators, and you haven't been thinking about less innovative target market, that's when you're going to run into an issue where your product is too sophisticated for the general crowd. Right.
Kind of that middle part of the innovator's dilemma.
Yep.
Or the, crossing the chasm, not innovator's dilemma, crossing the chasm. We're cycling through books here.
And that's where things can become really difficult, because you have a product and there's a group of customers who love it and use it and raving about it, but the rest just doesn't get it.
Yeah.
And then the question is, either you dumb down the product to bring it to market, or you wait for the market to arrive to you.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes it's one of the two.
Yeah. And what about maybe shifting gears, and you don't have to get into specifics here, but when what advice would you have for folks around fundraising, board structure? I mean, I've always found that you put a lot of thought into that. You were obviously very successful at raising capital, have a terrific board. You also have some amazing mentors and advisors that have been helpful to you along the way. What, and maybe this is advice you've shared with folks in the YC community. I'd love it. Whatever you can share here, whatever comes to mind on those topics would be amazing.
Yeah. I mean, board design is something that is very, very hard, because you don't get to do it often. And most people just take who they get, and then you figure out to work with them. I found that you have to be very intentional with the board design. You have to have spent not just the dating time, but actually have seen people in action through good and through bad before you add them to a board. It is very important to also establish initially the right culture and the right mode of operating with your board, set expectations, because the boards can be the inspecting boards or participating boards. And inspecting boards are, I guess, more helpful in terms of keeping you in check, but then they're not going to be as helpful in terms of helping drive the business forward. And I've seen the most successful boards are the ones where everybody is on the same team, and the board feels like they need to put in the work, not just inspect the company.
Yeah.
And so setting those expectations up front is very important.
What about raising capital? Any tips you'd offer folks there? I thought well, one thing I would also say you did an amazing job of along the way was I love your monthly updates that you would send. Mm-hmm. I know it's one of your secret superpowers, so I don't want to give away your secret sauce, but ever since the very early days of People.ai, you would very specifically talk about customers that you wanted introductions to, people you were looking to hire. Mm-hmm. It was a very personalized email. Any advice you can share there for founders? Because I think it worked. I think it was helpful.
Consistency is everything. So if you start doing monthly, you got to keep on going, and you got to keep on doing monthly for as long as you can. Ideally, hire chief of staff and keep on going with that. Just because I think there is a subliminal value to seeing not just that this company is sending updates, but they're sending them consistently in the same format. And it's clear that they are producing value, or they're getting value out of this, and they engage in the investor community. And I'm sure you've seen this with companies that aren't doing well, where founders are kind of going a little bit dark and offline and stop communicating just because it's hard. Yeah. And so just being open and having these active conversations is what actually creates a lot of goodwill in the investor community. That's one piece on fundraising. Second one is you have to be very intentional and structured about what you fundraise for, how you fundraise, and who you fundraise from.
Mhm.
A lot of people just jump into the process and then go with the flow, which I believe is probably the worst thing you could be doing, because like my personal strategy is you start with knowing everything you can about every possible investor who would be a value add for your company, from Twitter, reading everybody's Twitter stream, and it's a lot, to blog posts, to actually emailing someone like Jeff Richards and saying, hey, I'm thinking of doing a company, or I'm working on a company in the space. I'm not ready to pitch you yet, but what is your thesis for this problem? Mm-hmm. Understanding everybody's thesis, understanding how well the reason why you and I clicked in the first meeting is because you have lived through the problem I was passionate about.
Yeah.
Guess what? Not every investor is passionate about every problem.
Yeah.
And there is 5-10 people who are really passionate about every problem out there. You just need to find them and put in the work. And so, I mean, it's the classic do your freaking homework scenario, where don't just go and shoot from the hip, but prepare, don't waste people's time, be very thoughtful and deep about why you want to talk to a specific person, and then have that thoughtful conversation.
Yeah. And in many cases, these are folks that you had built relationships with over a long period of time, sending them your updates. They, building goodwill with people in their orbit who told them, hey, this guy's good, this company's on the rise.
Yep.
I mean, I look at some of the folks you brought in as angel investors early on and advisors, and the circle of the network in Silicon Valley is not small, or it is small, but it has a big impact.
Yeah.
What about just growth? What about how have you handled growth? I mean, it's just such a hard thing and you had been, you both started a company prior to this and been a part of other startups. One of our LPs asked me the other day, you guys, every company you fund at Series A, B, et cetera, has product market fit. What's the difference between the ones that scale up and become successful public companies and manage that growth? And I said, it's company building. It's less about the product and more about the company building element of managing growth, managing cash, managing the board, the investors, but it's an art.
Yeah.
Any advice you can share there?
Hire a CFO.
I love it. Okay, good. We're on the same page on that one.
Yeah. So
thank
hire
you.
a CFO. I wish I had hired a CFO at about 7-8 million ARR. I hired much later. Life becomes so much simpler when there is someone watching cash and actually thinking long term about cash in the company. I had no idea how much sophistication I was missing until I got a professional in the house.
Yeah.
So that's an important one.
So your advice is 7 to 10 million. It's time.
You got to have a good CFO.
Yeah, great. I love that. I couldn't agree more.
Side. The conventional wisdom is 15, 20, 25 ARR, whatever it is.
The earlier, the better.
Yep. Second piece is, for earlier stage, my advice for early companies is hire first 2 reps, don't hire a sales leader. And then only hire the next 2 reps and a sales leader after your first 2 reps have closed 10 deals that the CEO has never heard about.
That you weren't involved in.
Yeah. If there is no CEO pixie dust on those deals and actually the 2 reps close 10 deals, suddenly you do have product market fit. There is no way. Now it's about tuning. And that's when you bring in a sales leader who can tune the knobs and figure out how to run the process, scale it up, get more people, more pipeline. But that proof of product market fit of 10 deals where CEO hasn't been involved is probably like the biggest signal on enterprise one can get.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a huge challenge. Obviously, we see it. Companies will get to 5, 6, 7 million of ARR, and all of those deals have had what I call superhero sales teams, which is the CEO, co-founder, and a rep.
Yeah.
And getting outside of that, where the reps can close deals without you involved, is a really important moment for a company.
Yeah. And most companies, a lot of companies don't cross that moment. And problem is you cannot be doing company building if you're in deals all the time. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question, because I know you also are an angel investor. What do you look for when you're, and again, this is unscripted, so I'm asking you, a whole basket of questions, but what do you look for? I mean, obviously you like to invest in companies in categories that you know well, but when you sit across from a founder, what are you looking for?
So that's interesting. I have a set of rules because I only dedicate 3 hours of my time per month to angel investing, and I'm very, very precise about it. And so that creates a time limit of how much time I can spend on it, how many companies I can look at, etc., which forced me to create a rule set that I have to follow in order to be successful at that. Obviously, we'll see in many years whether I'm successful or not, but so far so good. My rule set is I don't take any cold inbounds ever. At least 2 people that I trust have to have introduced me or invested in this company. So that's just pure validation, which, and to be honest, in this time and world, if the founder cannot get a couple angels to invest in them, we have a different problem. And then I look into, I have to be in love with 2 out of 3 things, which is team, product, or market. So I allow 1 of the 3 not to be perfect. And lastly, I ask myself a question: would I work for this founder?
I love that question.
And if I'd say I wouldn't work for this founder, like it's a no-go.
Yeah.
And it becomes very black and white. Like, would you work for someone?
Yeah.
It's very clear to answer the question.
Yeah. Hey, so on that note, you talking about the 3 hours and the structure, I know you're a pretty structured guy. At least you put a lot of thought into the way you spend your time and relationships and things like that. I know when you reach out to me, obviously we catch up, but then you usually have a fairly cogent list of things you want to cover. What advice do you have for founders and CEOs about managing their time and sort of life? I don't want to call it work-life balance, but just like, it's hard. Being a CEO is a hard job. And in particular in 2022, it's a really freaking hard job this year. So any advice or thoughts you can share, or lessons that you've learned along the way about handling the role?
You touched upon this one. So open up your calendar and then put an agenda into every meeting invite you have on your calendar. And if you cannot come up with an agenda for that meeting, kill it.
Cancel the meeting.
That's it. It's that simple.
Yeah.
Like, if you literally have nothing to do with that person, which means you couldn't come up with a good agenda, why are you having the meeting?
And it probably also helps you limit the time, right? You don't end up spending 30 minutes chit-chatting if it's not on your agenda.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can budget 5-minute chit-chat, but then you're going to have agenda items.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is important, like meeting hygiene. I've tried all kinds of products, People.ai itself, but it's not our core kind of product direction, but there is also a YC company called Time Tackle. It basically downloads a calendar, allows you to tag calendar, and gives you analytics, which was helpful in the beginning to just find time sucks. And then in the beginning, I learned from a founder probably 7 or 8 years ago. There was a guy named David Castens. I don't know where he is now, but he basically told me for things he's not sure about, like inbound requests he's not sure about, he just ignores. And if it's important, they'll ask again.
Yeah.
And if it's really important, they'll ask again. And he's like, 80% of things just go away on their own.
Yeah, there is some logic to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not fully subscribing to that logic, but then on the other hand, you have to managing your calendar is one thing, but managing your inbound and having a system of triage for your inbound is another thing. So for example, like I literally have set up rule sets with my assistant of things she can just archive and I'll never see them in my inbox. And then more importantly, she goes through my inbox every day and bumps up things that are important to her. And I teach her what's important, what's not over time. It becomes better and better. And then I block off certain priority times per week to clear out the backlog. But then on the other hand, you can never reach that elusive inbox zero. So you have to have a system.
No. Yeah. All right, let me shift gears to the personal side. So you're from Ukraine. The last year has been crazy. You and I have chatted a lot about your background and sort of what's going on. I'd just love any thoughts you can share on I don't know what stories you're willing to tell or how much you want to share with people, but you have a pretty amazing story just in terms of your background, having grown up there and your relationships with a lot of the folks that are, frankly, leading the country. And I'd just be curious, any anecdotes or stories you can share that you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting is I find that this is probably the first really open source war that ever happened, the first open source conflict on the planet, where what people don't realize is that a lot of the Ukrainian military is actually engineers, computer engineers. They graduated, they got drafted, and they are motivated to go and fight, which leads to a lot of engineering approaches taking place on the front lines. And then that's what we're seeing. We're seeing an engineering-driven approach to non-engineering-driven approach on the battlefield. Some of the stories, I mean, there are some kind of where we haven't thought about it, where in the first hours of the war, all the mapping providers, Google's, Apple's of the world, etc. Actually, let me track back. When you put 50 trucks on a highway moving at 30 miles an hour, every traffic system, Waze of the world, etc., is going to say there's traffic on the highway. Turns out when the war starts, there's a lot of convoys that are fanning out from the cities. And so we, as a society, weren't prepared to the fact that technology is actually going to have a major say in how the war today is led.
Yeah.
And so, for example, turning off traffic layer, which Google and Apple both did early in the war, was an important thing to not expose military assets on the Ukrainian side. Now, these was Starlinks, when how important those were. Turns out connectivity, uninterruptible, untrackable, unjammable connectivity.
I mean, arguably, that's one of the biggest game changers of this entire battle has been the fact that Starlink, and I know you played a role in that, went live in Ukraine, the day after Russia attacked, or 4 days after?
Yeah.
I mean, had that not happened, I can't even imagine where this would have gone.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is all satellite communications from other companies were compromised at the time. So yeah, definitely this would be a very different outcome had not Starlink been delivered to Ukraine there. But also there is other things that are happening right now that people don't realize that we only have seen in the movies. For example, drone swarms, these Iranian drones that are happening. This is the first time a military is using a software-defined drone swarms to economically overwhelm defending side.
What does that mean? Can you explain that for folks?
So the Iranian drones, Iran being under sanctions for more than a decade now, had made a decision that any drones they built have to be built on anything you could buy on Alibaba. That's the rule. If you cannot buy it on Alibaba, you cannot build a drone. Which is smart, because now you can't put in any sanctions because that's what it is. And so the drones that they build, the swarms, they have like a mothership drone, and then they have a bunch of really cheap drones. The cheap ones cost $20,000 a pop, with everything, with margin, like 40-60% profit margin, etc. And they're super dumb. They're just going from point A to point B, and then they find the hottest thing that's there. They have an infrared sensor and then slam into that thing. Now, where the economics come in that is really, really dangerous is that those things at 20 grand, you can, if they fly so high that you cannot take them out with cheap things. You have to launch a $300,000 to $500,000 surface-to-air missile to take out one $20,000 drone.
Wow.
Now you fly 50 of those drones, and suddenly you DDoS enemies or your defending side's aerial defense system. So this was not possible when you had to have 50 video links and 50 operators and whatnot, and people detecting where the people are. This is fully autonomous, and it's happening right now. And this is exactly what the horror movies were 3 years ago.
Yeah. It's so wild. And you also were telling me stories about, given the technical sophistication of the Ukrainian population as well as the army, their ability to leverage all these open source technologies and build various things in the field that didn't exist. I mean, literally building them on the fly. We generally think of military as like, 5-10 year product development cycles, and they were literally building things on the fly. Yeah,
Ukrainian C3 software, so command and control software that they're using in the field, is a fork of an open source piece of software that you can download today. And there are literally people who are shooting a gun and then going back into the trench, firing up a Starlink and writing a commit and submitting it to GitHub.
Amazing.
Happening all over the place. And I mean, that's the new speed of war, which is speed of open source or cloud software.
Yeah.
And we can see really clearly how one side is staying abreast of it and the other side is really not keeping up, not even getting it.
Yeah. Well, I want to be conscious of time, but if we're all optimistic about how it all plays out, where do you think Ukraine and Russia are a year from now, or in whatever time frame, if we have a positive light?
I'm not going to speculate on the Russian side, but there is a semi-dream, semi-vision for Ukraine that myself and as well as a lot of people in the Ukrainian government are really sharing, which is there's another country on the planet that is surrounded by hostile environment, that has gone through a number of wars, has been very technologically savvy, and has spawned some of the world's best companies and has one of the most impressive economies on the planet. It's called Israel. Mm-hmm. And so like Russia is not going anywhere. They're not going to relocate to another continent. They'll always be a neighbor, which means the only way Ukraine will be successful in the future is by following the footsteps of Israel and building hardened but yet very liberal and very sophisticated society on the border with the enemy that allows them to evolve.
I hope you're right. Israel's an amazing place and an amazing country. We're lucky to back a number of founders in Israel, and our team spends a lot of time there. And it's there's a ton of innovation coming out of there. And I love that vision. I hope Ukraine becomes a hotbed of innovation, and obviously, I hope it all ends, in the most positive way it can.
Well, I mean, if you had a chance to be a seed investor into every Israeli company, it's trillions of dollars in enterprise value that was created.
Well, hopefully this all ends in some peaceful way. And hopefully there is a ton of capital that flows into Ukraine, not only for that reason. Obviously, there's a lot of rebuilding that's going to have to take place, but if people see it as a place where there is innovation and opportunity, that'll be an exciting outcome. So
I believe that's going to happen. We have a lot of people who are very supporting, and I do think there's a lot of work to be done, both in terms of investing, but also the whole world will be rebuilding Ukraine. I mean, it's trillions of dollars that will go into economy, and when you have in the new Marshall Plan, good things happen, good companies are born, new industries are being created.
Yeah.
And you're also going to have almost 1 million of people, a lot of engineers with combat experience coming back with a number of ideas, both of how the society, but also the military and the technology should operate. So it's going to be a big creative spur. Awesome.
We're praying for you.
Thank you.
All right, Oleg, thanks, man. Thanks for being such a great founder. Thanks for being a great mentor to a number of our founders. And thanks for sharing all your thoughts. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'm glad to thank you for backing me as one of the first people to back me and myself as a founder, and being by my side for it's almost 7 years now.
That's pretty incredible. I was thinking 5, but 7 is, it's a long time. But
next April will be our 7th anniversary.
It's been a lot of fun. It's been fun to watch you build.
Thank you.
All right, man. Thanks, Oleg.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much.